Tom, please. The floor is yours.
Hi, everybody. Do you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
So thanks for inviting me again. I have been in the Hannes show already twice. And I've been asked to talk at this time about the Europeanization of the French and British nuclear weapons, which is part, of course, of the previous discussion, the European militarization in general. The trigger of the latest debate was the incident in the Oval Office between Zelensky and Trump, you all remember. And after that, this zombie debate started up again. The underlying is the fear in Europe of abandonment by the United States. That means that NATO may disappear, or at least that the US security guarantee becomes hollow, that the United States may withdraw from NATO, or partly, just maybe withdrawing all the troops, and there are still 90,000 troops in Europe, US troops, or withdrawing the tactical nuclear weapons. So there are still 100 tactical nuclear weapons from the United States in 5 NATO member states, in Belgium, my own country, in the Netherlands, in Germany, in Italy, and in Turkey. This reaction by the Europeans fits, in my view, in the hysterical reaction by the European Union leaders since Trump tries to make peace between Ukraine and Russia. Instead of being happy that there's at least somebody trying to resolve the conflict in Ukraine, the EU is very fearful that it will be alone against the Russian threat. So I think somebody should tell Brussels that the war may be over in a couple of months, and that we don't need this militarization, and certainly not the Europeanization of the nuclear weapons of France and the United Kingdom. I call it hysterical, history, hysteria in Brussels. There is even fear that even after a peace agreement, Russia will rearm and start attacking again other West European states, East European states. I don't believe that. If there's a good peace agreement, then that will not happen. But it says a lot about the bubble that we are living in the European Union. Okay. So let's come back to the Europeanization debate. It's not new. Sometimes it comes up and then it dies again. That's why others call it the zombie debate. I remember the first time, it was in 1995, after the French nuclear tests by Chirac. And then there was this proposal by the French for a dissuasion concertée, a kind of European deterrent, a Eurobomb. And there were some positive reactions at that time by German Christian Democrats, and even and Belgian and Dutch Christian Democrats, and even some social democrats from our countries. But it faded, and I covered it in my first book, in the epilogue of my first book in 1998. Sorry. Then when Trump came to power for the first time, the debate started again. It was again this fear of abandonment. And then in 2020, Macron gave a speech in Paris, again proposing a kind of dissuasion concertée. And that's when I wrote my academic article that Hannes just posted in the chat. And when the war started in 2022, the debate came up again, and died immediately. I think this time it's maybe different. It may be different. Why? Because the war is still going on. There is Trump in the White House, unpredictable, also for the Europeans. And maybe most important, this time, at the highest level, the idea has been endorsed by more than one leader in the European Union. First of all, and most important, by the German next Chancellor, Merz. There was our own Belgian Prime Minister who positively talked about it. I've read that also the Finnish Prime Minister spoke positively about the idea of Europeanization of the French-British nuclear weapons. And also in Poland, there were this time positive reactions. And maybe in other countries, I don't know. Now, most of them said it should be a complement to the existing US umbrella, nuclear umbrella. But if the United States withdraw these US nuclear weapons, then we are on our own. And then people like Merz probably agree with the Europeanization of the French nuclear weapons and maybe British nuclear weapons. I'll come back to that in a moment, the concrete scenarios. And it fits, of course, in the idea of European defense integration, which is going on already for decades and now accelerating due to the war in Ukraine and coming to power of President Trump. So I personally not in favor, as you can imagine, and I see 4 criticisms that can be pointed out. The first one is a general criticism on nuclear weapons. Nuclear deterrence, the assumption that nuclear deterrence works is highly debatable, and in all likelihood overblown, especially nuclear weapons in the hands of democracies, and we are talking about democracies in Europe. So nuclear deterrence only works if the enemy believes that these nuclear weapons will be used in last resort. Now, my question to you, do you think that Putin believes that Macron or Starmer is going to use nuclear weapons? I don't think so. Just look to what happened in the war in Ukraine. When Ukraine was winning in the autumn of 2022, then there was a debate in Russia to use tactical nuclear weapons against Ukraine. Apparently, the CIA estimated that the chance were 50-50. And then Biden implicitly stated that if Putin would use a nuclear weapon in Ukraine, he would not answer with nuclear weapons, would not retaliate with nuclear weapons. I think that's a smart idea, but if you say it loudly, you undermine, of course, your nuclear deterrent. Macron went even further at that time, and he said explicitly, I'm not going to use nuclear weapons. So I can wonder if we Europeanize the French nuclear weapons and maybe British nuclear weapons, how credible they are. So in short, there are uncertain benefits with respect to nuclear deterrence, and of course, certain costs, like financial costs, security risks, ethical costs, legal costs, and so on. In addition, there are new technologies, as you know, new disruptive technologies like AI, cyber, hypersonics, and the impact of these new technologies and weapon systems on nuclear deterrence is destabilizing. And there's a consensus in the literature. I've written another report on this, published in December by the EU Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Consortium, in which I made that point. And I have made a presentation for British Bookwash on this subject. Now, a second criticism is related to the idea of extended nuclear deterrence. That means the idea of a nuclear umbrella. In the first point, I criticized nuclear deterrence in general. Here, I criticize the idea of extended nuclear deterrence in particular. The idea that one state helps another state by its nuclear umbrella. That is, of course, even more incredible. Because who believes, and that was what Kissinger already said in the Cold War, who believes that the United States is going to help the Europeans if they are attacked by the Russians with nuclear weapons? knowing that if the Americans will help us with nuclear weapons, they will be attacked with nuclear weapons by Russians. So the Americans were not going to do that, and everybody knew it. And that's exactly the reason why France, President de Gaulle, did not want to shield under the US nuclear umbrella. And that's why France built its own nuclear arsenal in the 50s and 60s. And ironically, now the French propose to extend their umbrella to us. Yeah, so I think it's very, it's not very credible for us to shield under the French umbrella, knowing that the French didn't want to shield under the American umbrella. Yeah, the counter argument is, of course, that France is closer geographically to Europe than America, but still, we can discuss that later on if you want. Then a third criticism is that by Europeanizing the French and maybe British nuclear weapons, we re-legitimize nuclear weapons. We are basically giving the message to the rest of the world are very good security instruments, which is, of course, not a very good idea with respect to nuclear proliferation. And it goes against the letter and the spirit of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, still the cornerstone of the whole non-proliferation regime. And it goes against the TPNW, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, of course. So if we now start Europeanizing the French and maybe British nuclear weapons, how credible is our demand vis-à-vis Iran not to build nuclear weapons? It's not sustainable. And so if in the worst case, some of these European states go nuclear by themselves, and Poland is really considering the idea. Germany, some in Germany maybe as well, but I don't think that will happen. But Poland is more realistic. If that happens, and if other states like South Korea follow, let alone Iran, that's the end of the NPT, and we end up in a kind of nuclear anarchy, and without any rules in the world with respect to non-proliferation and disarmament. A last criticism is that it will be practically very difficult to make such Europeanization real. And here there are different scenarios, starting from the easiest. The easiest thing is to make it more explicit that the European interests are the French interests, and that if a country in the European Union is attacked, that France sees this as an attack against France. It is already, to a certain extent, the case. For instance, in the Lisbon Treaty, EU treaty, there is a collective defense clause, similar to NATO. Now, for the moment, other member states do not recognize that, the French nuclear weapons, not explicitly. So another step would be if states like Germany start to recognize the French nuclear weapons in the European defense more explicitly. It will not happen in the EU as such, because there are neutral member states like Austria and Ireland, but it will be a coalition of the willing. France, Germany, the Benelux countries, maybe Italy, I don't know, Denmark, the Nordic states. Another step further is information exchange by the French and joint consultations and joint exercises with these nuclear weapons, with the Germans, with Belgians and the Dutch. And that's a bit the idea of a kind of European nuclear planning group, which exists in NATO. In NATO there exists a NATO nuclear planning group. Ironically, all NATO member states are part of this group for consultation and exercises, except France. France does not want to be in this NATO nuclear planning group, but one could imagine that a similar setup is organized in Europe and without the United States. And then another further step is co-financing. And the Germans apparently are willing to co-finance the French nuclear weapons. There are some voices in Germany having said that, directly or indirectly, by, for instance, saying to the France that they do not have to pay for a conventional defense project they are working on. And a further step would be to station the French Rafales in other member states, like in Germany or in Poland. That's that is a further step. Now, the problem with this last step and even with the co-financing step is who will ultimately decides about the use of these nuclear weapons. And here Macron is very clear. He said, it's me. That's typical the French nuclear doctrine. They do not want to share it. Instead of in NATO, it's different. It's more democratic, if you want. But then the question is, will Germany be ready to pay for French nuclear weapons that in times of crisis will be used only by the French president? I don't think so. But there are some Germans in the room here, so they can maybe share their ideas. By the way, in a couple of months or years, there may be another French president named Le Pen. She is not willing to share the French nuclear weapons to Europe. That's another practical problem. And a last scenario is, and that's of course democratically speaking the most legitimate, if we really have a European Defence Union and a political union, a federal Europe, then of course the nuclear weapons that are there should be Europeanized as well, by definition. But we are far from there. So to conclude, I think as long as there are American nuclear weapons in Europe, why bother about a European bomb? As long as there are 500 French and British nuclear weapons around, and that's the number, more than 500, why bother about Europeanization? Ideally, I think we should organize our security and defense in the EU. I have given a presentation in December, I believe, or November last year on this, without NATO. I'm not a NATO fan. But in a European, bigger collective security organization that includes Russia and Ukraine in the second layer. And so if that happens, then there is no need for a nuclear weapon. And I think we could replace this nuclear deterrent by conventional deterrent. That's also in my December paper. This conventional deterrent is more credible because it's usable, while nuclear weapons are not usable because if they are used, they go against international humanitarian law. And that's therefore not credible. That's basically it, Hannes.
Okay, thanks a lot.